Good evening, everyone. My name is Julie Menders. I'm the Adult Programming Coordinator at Otis Library in Norwich, Connecticut. Welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening as part of Harris Sisters Month at Otis Library. Every April, we celebrate Sarah and Mary Harris. And for more information on that subject, I encourage you to visit the Otis Library website, otislibrarynorwich.org/Harris Sisters Month, to see our full scope of all the programs we have going on this month, plus all additional information on Sarah and Mary Harris and the Prudence Crandall School. So thank you so much for joining us. This evening, we are welcoming author Donald E. Williams, Jr. He's spoken with us over Harris Sisters Month several times now, and we're always so happy to have him join us. Let me see. I'm going to just give you a little bit of background on Mr. Williams. Donald E. Williams, Jr., he's the former president of the Connecticut State Senate. He's the former executive director for the Connecticut Education Association. He holds a JD from Washington and Lee University School of Law and a BS in journalism from Syracuse University. He lives in Brooklyn, Connecticut. He is the author of Prudence Crandall's Legacy, The Fight for Equality in the 1830s, Dred Scott, and Brown versus Board of Education. This is such a fascinating subject, and all the programs that we do have in April for Harris Sisters Month are sponsored by the Elsie Brown Fund. And I would also like to thank the Harris Sisters Planning Committee who helped to put these programs together. Also, a few of them are here with us this evening. So I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Williams and thank him again for joining us and for agreeing to be part of Harris Sisters Month at Otis Library. So thank you, Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Julie, and thanks to the committee, thanks to Otis Library in Norwich, and thank you for joining us here this evening. This is called Prudence Crandall and Sarah Harris and their fight for equality. And what that really is an amazing historical story that impacts us today. And when we think of desegregation, we usually think of the 1950s, the Brown versus Board of Education case, and how that was the beginning and not the end of desegregation in America, the reversal of the Plessy v. Ferguson case that was decided in the 1890s and formalized the legality of a segregated America in schools and many other public places. And Brown v. Board overruled that. That was 121 years after Prudence Crandall opened her school. And due to a series of events and due to her first Black student, Sarah Harris, and her asking to be a student, tried to do what was accomplished in 1954, have a classroom with white and Black students sharing an education. So Sarah Harris, it's very important that we take a look at Sarah and her family, because without Sarah Harris, there would not be a Prudence Crandall school story. Prudence Crandall had started a school and it was very successful in the early 1830s. But Sarah Harris was someone who lived in Canterbury. Her family had moved from Norwich to Canterbury. And she asked at one point, after working as an assistant at the school, if she could be a student. Now, another person who was an assistant at the school had occasionally sat in on classes, and Sarah had noticed that and wanted to have an education, but she wanted to formalize the relationship. She wanted not just to be an assistant who occasionally sat in, but someone who was a student like the other young white women at Prudence Crandall's school. Now, her family was literate. They read a wide variety of things, including anti-slavery material and literature that talked about equal rights for all in the United States. Her father was the subscription agent for The Liberator, which was perhaps the most famous anti-slavery newspaper, and it was edited and overseen by William Lloyd Garrison in Boston. Now, Prudence Crandall, she was someone who was a school teacher, as you probably know, in the 1830s. She created a school for young women that was very successful. She's Connecticut State's heroine, and that portrait right there, that beautiful portrait, was painted by Francis Alexander in 1834, at the time of peak controversy for the school when Prudence Crandall was 30 years old. The Harris family, again, they came from Norwich. Now, her mother was part of the Mohegan tribe, Sally Prentice. Her father came from the West Indies, which is a collection of those countries on the screen right there. And William came to the United States because he was interested in opportunity, but he was also interested in education. This was a family that was interested in making sure that their sons and daughters had opportunity, even though the deck was stacked against them in the United States. So Norwich was where they ultimately settled. There were 12 children in total in the Harris family. There were 3, Sarah, her sister Mary, and her brother Charles, who were all involved in either, eventually Sarah was a student, but Charles and Mary helped out as assistants at the school at various times. Again, the family was involved in abolitionist activities in the Norwich area, and the father, William, was a subscription agent for that very famous newspaper, The Liberator. Now, just to go back and think of where we were and what the span was in terms of Prudence Crandall's lifetime, this is what the US looked like when Prudence Crandall was born. Thomas Jefferson was president of the United States. We just added the Louisiana Purchase. Quite a different world. The United States was in its infancy. And of course, with Jefferson as president when she was born, there was that famous quote that he drafted in the Declaration of Independence: all men are created equal with unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's a wonderful quotation, one that every school child learns. One big problem. Those declarations of equality and freedom ran headlong into an economic cornerstone of America at that time, and that's slavery. It was a social, economic, and moral failing, and it was a topic and a practice of great controversy almost from the outset. But slavery was essential, really, in the South. It helped the plantation economy. And a lot of times in the North, folks think that, well, you know, that was the Southern problem. We had the Civil War. The North was on, they were the good guys. It was the states in the South dependent on slavery. That was so horrible and terrible. In fact, the North was complicit. It was complicit in terms of how our country was founded, how the Constitution was drafted, but very importantly, economically, the North was complicit as well. I'd recommend Traces of the Trade, which is a book and a documentary on DVD that talks about Rhode Island and seaports there that were involved directly, in Bristol, directly with the slave trade. But in addition to that, the growth of mills, particularly textile mills in the North, was because of the incredible cotton crop that was coming out of the South that was being produced with slave labor. Now, Prudence Crandall was born in Rhode Island. Pardon and Esther Crandall were her parents. She lived in a pretty well-to-do family. Her grandfather, who lived in Rhode Island, and he owned a series of mills, and the town was named after him. His last name was Carpenter, and the town was called Carpenter's Mills. And when he passed away, they came into a significant inheritance. With that inheritance, they were able to go to Connecticut and buy a farm in Canterbury. Prudence Crandall did face challenges, as all women did, by law at that time, and also by custom. Now, she had an incredibly unusual childhood, though, because the Crandalls had some economic means. They not only were able to buy the farm, but they also placed a high priority on education. Education not only for their son, Reuben, but also education for their two daughters, Prudence and also for Sarah. So the difference here was that most young women never had any sort of formal education in the way we think of it today. And there were finishing schools, schools that were able to provide tips and skills that a housewife would have. But Prudence Crandall was sent by her parents to a school, a Quaker school in nearby Plainfield, which was a pretty easy horseback ride away from Canterbury. And it was run, the principal of that school was an abolitionist who wrote for the Liberator, wrote occasional articles for William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator anti-slavery paper. And then after she completed her studies there, her parents sent her as a boarding student to the Friends School in Providence, Rhode Island. It was run by Moses Brown, who you probably heard of. He was a Quaker abolitionist. He was fairly elderly at that time, but still running the school. She boarded there for 4 years. Now, she was exposed to students from all over New England who were very interested in education. The school was coeducational. That was very unusual as well. You weren't talking about a finishing school for women. These were serious subjects, not unlike we would find in high school with a demanding curriculum. Now, after graduating from the Friends School, Prudence wanted to have her own school, but she needed to get her feet wet. She was able, and she knew that she was going to face problems in terms of how could a woman afford to open a school and have all of the responsibility that would ordinarily be held by men. So she started out teaching in other schools in Eastern Connecticut, and one in Plainfield, and a few others before, with the help of her family, she purchased what is now the Prudence Crandall Museum, but a very prominent home in the center of Canterbury with the idea that she would open a school. Now, she was encouraged to do so by the town fathers. They thought this was a fantastic idea, that it would put Canterbury on the map, which would be wonderful, increase their profile, visibility, maybe bring other folks to Canterbury. So the town fathers thought that this was a good step, not only in order to provide real education for young women from the families who could afford to pay the tuition, but also to help promote their town. So Prudence Crandall very quickly became the overseer, the principal, if you will, of a very successful school for young women. And she was in an extremely unique position for a woman in the United States of America, because she owned the building. There was a mortgage on it, but she was the owner of the building. Also, she was the principal of the school. She made the decision in terms of what the curriculum would be, the teachers and assistants who would be hired, all of the oversight in terms of managing the school and making the purchases and arrangements necessary to, in some cases, board young women who would stay at the school, but certainly to manage their education. Now, she was able to do this because she was not married, because if she'd been married, then all of that responsibility, particularly the owning of property, the signing off on contracts, et cetera, would have been the responsibility of her husband. Now, the Harris family moved from Norwich to Canterbury in 1832. They bought a farm and pretty quickly established contact with Prudence Crandall's school. This is a picture of Mary Harris, who's the sister of Sarah Harris. Mary also became a student at the school. And Charles, of course, as I mentioned, before. He also helped out at the school, and he became engaged to Anne Mariah Davis, who worked as an assistant at Prudence Crandall's school. So already in very short order, the Harris family, after coming to Canterbury, made a number of connections with Prudence Crandall and her school. Now, as I mentioned before briefly, a critical source of information for the Harris family was the Liberator. This gives you a view of the masthead of the Liberator in its first year. It began the same year that Prudence Crandall began her activities in education in 1831. And again, her father was a subscription agent for the Liberator. So he was in touch with William Lloyd Garrison, and he was, what does the agent do? Get subscriptions. So he was out there signing folks up who would then pay money to receive the Liberator. Now, Sarah Harris's brother Charles, as I mentioned, was engaged to Mariah Davis, and she read the Liberator that came into the Harris household, and she began taking copies of the Liberator to work with her at Crandall's school. Crandall noticed that, and Mariah offered to let Crandall read one of the issues. And Prudence Crandall said, please keep bringing these. I would like to read more of the Liberator. At this very time, some of the articles written in the Liberator, which were filled with articles that were anti-slavery and pro-equality, some of the articles were written by Maria Stewart, a Black woman who was born in Hartford, Connecticut, who became self-educated, learned how to read, and then became an activist in Boston, speaking out against slavery and promoting the rights of and education for women. And she wrote articles to that effect that were being published in the Liberator. My guess is Prudence Crandall, in addition to the other articles that she read that were anti-slavery, probably read Maria Stewart as well. So by fall 1832, you have a very successful school. It's full to capacity of young white women from middle-class families in northeastern Connecticut, and they were getting a very, very good education. Also in fall 1832, this is after the school had been open for about a year, Sarah Harris approached Prudence Crandall and asked her if she could be a student, not just someone who's an assistant who would sit in on some of the classes like Mariah, but she wanted to be recognized as a student in the school along with the other young white women. So Prudence Crandall put off answering. It wasn't as if she said, oh yes, absolutely, that would be no problem. She understood that if she admitted Sarah that there would most likely be controversy, perhaps it would injure her school in one way or another. So she put it off. Time said, I'll get back to you. Time went by, and Sarah eventually, after what was at least a number of weeks, came back to Prudence Crandall, asked her again. And after Prudence had done some obvious soul searching, touching on her religious background, growing up as a Quaker, she'd recently become a Baptist and had been baptized and had been reading the Liberator and other anti-slavery literature, said yes to Sarah, and she was admitted as a student. Now, as she was admitted, the other students accepted her without controversy. They'd seen her working in the school. They'd seen her at a local congregational church, not a big problem. As soon as the parents found out, there was terrible, terrible controversy. And the town fathers, who had once been very supportive, including her neighbor across the street, Andrew Judson, who was an attorney and also a state representative to the Connecticut legislature, came to Prudence and basically said, if you do not expel Sarah, then we will find a way to shut down your school. And they had some ideas in mind. Local merchants would stop selling goods to her school. Parents threatened to withdraw their daughters from their school. Prudence thought she would probably lose her school. At the same time, she was adamantly opposed to giving in to this economic blackmail, in addition to human unfairness, and wanted to find another alternative. Remember, that was fall 1832. By January 1833, Prudence Crandall had an alternative in mind, and she was going to go to Boston. She had a fully formed plan that she wanted to unveil. However, one wonders, how did Prudence Crandall come up with this plan? Because she wasn't reaching out to other folks in her circle at the school. She wasn't reaching out to friends and neighbors in the white community in Canterbury. She wanted to go to Boston to see William Lloyd Garrison, the editor of the infamous, some people thought, anti-slavery newspaper. And she had a fully formed plan, which was basically going to be, look, I've got this school. Folks want me to close it. I don't want to expel my one Black female student. Here's my idea. My idea is that I'm going to close my school and reopen it as a school for Black women only. But I need your help because you have subscribers, including hundreds of Black families in Connecticut, in Massachusetts, in Rhode Island, in New York. And what I plan to do is to reach out to them, reach out to those families, recruit their daughters of color, and have this as a haven to promote education for young women who are Black and who are desperate for that education. Now, I'm convinced, even though I've not been able to find any written documentary evidence, that the Harris family had to have been involved in helping Prudence come up with this idea. First and foremost, because it was William Harris who was the Liberator's agent. He lived in Canterbury. He had his address. He had a relationship with Garrison. It would have been natural for some communication and conversation to have happened, either between Prudence and Sarah, or Prudence and William Harris, or some combination of that, for the light bulb, even though they didn't exist back then, to have gone off and given that idea, look, why don't you talk to Garrison? Of course, it was Prudence's idea, I think, that through that contact, something that Garrison hadn't even thought of, that this could provide the means of mobilizing the Black community in those cities and elsewhere to be able to put something together like a school for young Black women. So there was every incentive for Prudence Crandall, and as her school project went forward, not to acknowledge the help of the Harris family or any other persons of color, because it would have been dangerous for those folks, and it would have played in to the hands of her critics, who were saying that she was not in control, but that there were the equivalent of outside agitators, a term that we heard during the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, that were guiding her, leading her, and creating this controversy. But I'm convinced that the Harris family played a crucial role, not only in Sarah asking to be a student and everything that followed from that, but also in offering ideas for the ultimate solution here, and a remarkable partnership between Prudence and her allies and William Lloyd Garrison and the Black communities that his newspaper touched. So after her meeting with Garrison in Boston, where she more or less floored him with the idea, and he was quick to say, yes, I can put you in touch with families in Boston and Providence, New Haven, New York, and elsewhere. She went directly from that meeting in Boston to Providence, and then very shortly after that to New Haven and to New York City, meeting with folks that Garrison had recommended, and meeting with those Black families, recruiting potential students. April 1st, 1833, she was able to open a school for Black women only. Now, it was a difficult situation in terms of her telling her white students who were not at fault. They didn't have a problem with Sarah that her school was closing, only that she knew her school could not survive and it would close anyway unless she was able to make a change, because those in the town, especially those who were running the town, would see to that. The school opened. It was full up within about 5 or 6 weeks, not right from day one, but slowly but steadily. Young Black women from throughout the Northeast came and enrolled in her school. There was even more backlash at this. If you can imagine how the town would react, right? They first started by saying, you know what, you got to expel Sarah. That's what you got to do. And now Prudence Crandall comes back and says, well, you know what? I'm not going to expel Sarah, but actually I'm going to close my school to the white women of Northeastern Connecticut and reopen it as a school for Black women only. And this was in 1833. It kind of blows your mind to think about the fortitude and what courage, incredible courage that Prudence Crandall had, and the help that she had from the Harris family, because there weren't a lot of people she could turn to. It was unbelievable to fathom today, in today's world, let alone in the 1830s. So in addition to the community outrage, and there was vandalism against her school, people throwing rocks and eggs against the school building, her neighbor from across the street, Andrew Judson, the attorney, the guy in the state legislature, he went to the legislature and got something passed called the Black Law. And the long and short of it was, since he knew that the vast majority of her students would be coming from out of state, he passed a law that said, no students of color from out of state can be educated in the state of Connecticut unless you get approval from the local authority, the Board of Selectmen, the municipal officials, which he knew would be impossible. That passed in the legislature. Now, at this time, Prudence Crandall had recruited some very important friends, the Burleigh brothers from Plainfield, Charles and William Burleigh. Charles helped, he founded actually a newspaper called The Unionist, which was the only local newspaper that was speaking out in her favor. William Burleigh taught at the school. Arnold Buffum was an abolitionist, that means anti-slavery activist from Massachusetts, who helped defend her at a town meeting in Canterbury, where she was being assailed by the townspeople. George Benson was an abolitionist in Brooklyn who lived near the courthouse. That would come in handy later on. Arthur Tappan was a merchant in New York City who'd earned lots of money. He was the equivalent of a pretty deep pocket millionaire for the time. And he was an abolitionist, learned about what Prudence Crandall was going through, because the controversy hit the papers and was going across the country, including New York City. And Samuel May, all the way on the side there, Unitarian minister, trained in Boston and was the Unitarian minister in Brooklyn. He became her close ally and also a teacher at the school. So the town did not sit still for this. The Black Law included criminal penalties and large fines. She was arrested and imprisoned in the Brooklyn jail. There's a whole long story I won't get into there about how she put her head together with her allies. They all put their hands together and said, we will not bail you out for the first day. It's very important that you actually go to jail. And she led that argument. She wanted to see the folks who ran the town of Canterbury have to put her in the local jail in Brooklyn. That became, as they expected, a national news story, bringing, at least for a moment, infamy on the town of Canterbury that here is a teacher going to jail for the crime of teaching Black women. Remember Arthur Tappan, the merchant with a lot of money in New York City? He bankrolled essentially the legal dream team for Prudence Crandall, which was Henry Strong, Calvin Goddard, William Ellsworth, who was the son of Oliver Ellsworth, who helped write the Constitution of the United States. So she had a pretty good team here, and they put together incredible arguments. This was the first full-throated civil rights case in the history of the United States, and the first time that head-on a court case would say that all free Black people in the United States were full citizens, entitled to all of the rights that white citizens enjoy. There were 3 trials. They were all held in the courthouse in Brooklyn, which was built in 1819, and it actually still serves as the town hall in Brooklyn. That's where I live. That's where I am right now in Brooklyn. And we had 3 of the first civil rights trials of any kind, but certainly on point in terms of the rights as citizens of Blacks in the United States, right here in Northeastern Connecticut. First trial, hung jury. Second trial, because of a judge who was pretty racist and predisposed against Prudence Crandall, who argued to the jury in his reading of the instructions to the jury, argued longer than most of the attorneys for either the prosecution or the defense. In that trial, she was found guilty. There was an appeal to the state Supreme Court that was heard about almost a year later, because her second trial was 1833, October. The appeal, it would take them until July, almost the end of July, 1834, to hear that case. Shot of the Brooklyn Courthouse, which is now the town hall. Many of you have probably seen or driven by this building at some point. In the midst of all this, there was a little bit of happiness, a double marriage ceremony. Sarah Harris married George Fairweather. Charles Harris, who was a brother of Sarah, married Anne Mariah Davis, who was one of the assistants at Prudence Crandall School. Prudence and all of her students attended that double marriage ceremony on November 28th, 1833. So there were almost 9 months leading up to that appeal. Actually, it was kind of a happy time for the school because her opponents kind of laid down their arms for a little bit. There were still some acts of vandalism, but they were going to wait for the Supreme Court to, in their hope, basically say, yes, the Black law is constitutional and the school is closed, and anybody who's a part of that can be locked up. And of course, what Prudence Crandall and her allies wanted was a case that could go to the US Supreme Court. So it did begin in July of 1834. There were historic arguments. If you want to glance at this, you can, but William Ellsworth was the lead attorney, and his arguments were incredibly persuasive and well stated, to the point that William Lloyd Garrison decided that he would get a copy, which he did, of all of Ellsworth's arguments, because Ellsworth wrote out most of what he said, and published them, which Garrison did, and he published them pretty widely throughout New England, and they had an impact on people who saw them at the time and later. Despite Ellsworth's very powerful arguments, the court did not side with Prudence Crandall and her attorneys. At the same time, deep down, they kind of believed that the Black law was unconstitutional. Later, 3 of the 4 justices said they would have voted to find the Black law unconstitutional. But the 4th one was David Daggett, who was actually the judge at the trial court level where Prudence Crandall was found guilty. Remember, he was the guy who was racist and who argued that Blacks are not citizens as part of the jury instructions. He was actually on the Supreme Court also. It was a time in our state history when if you were a Supreme Court justice, you could also hear cases at the trial level. I guess it was economical, efficient, maybe. But what seems a little odd is that they didn't look at this as a fatal conflict of interest to be sitting on the Supreme Court in judgment of your own decision at the trial court decision below. And yet there he was the Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court. The other justices felt embarrassed about overruling him 3-1. So they threw the case out on a technicality. But I've taken a look at the documents. I've taken a look at the complaint. I won't bore you with all the details of this. They claimed there was a defect in the original complaint, and they didn't have some magic words, saying that they failed to get a license or consent in writing from a majority of the civil authority, which means the local board of selectmen, the town officials. I took a look at that original complaint. The language is there. It says without consent in writing, first obtained by the majority of the civil authority. So the Supreme Court knew that decision, throwing it out on a technicality, could not be appealed. So my assessment, and I challenge anybody to prove me wrong on this based on my reading of that, is that they kind of made that up because it was a hot potato. On the one hand, they didn't want to embarrass Justice Daggett. Probably they realized how kind of radical that just might be to rule that the Black law was unconstitutional and that free Blacks were citizens, not just people without rights, but citizens with rights equal to white citizens as well. Again, I won't bore you with all of the tragic missed opportunities you can imagine. And I've just stated some of them, but if they had thrown out the Black law, or if they had upheld the Black law, that case most likely would have gone to the US Supreme Court. Now, I think that it would have taken a miracle for the Supreme Court to have also held that the Black law was unconstitutional, but you never know. There were only 7 justices on the Supreme Court at that time. A majority were from northern states, and one of the southern justices, Justice Marshall, the historic Justice Marshall, was from Virginia, but he hated slavery. You just don't know what would have happened, and it would have been fascinating to have seen the Supreme Court in some way weigh in, but most likely they would have found a way to not rule on the merits of that case. In any case, by kicking this to the curb on a technicality, everybody was mad. Prudence Crandall and her allies, and certainly her opponents in Canterbury. So a month later, Prudence Crandall married Calvin Filio. He was a Baptist minister who'd come from Rhode Island, Pawtucket. He'd read about Prudence Crandall in the newspapers. His wife had died recently. He had young children. He was in the market, quite literally, for a wife. He'd scoped out some other prospects, offended some people in the process. Prudence Crandall's friends were not wild about Calvin by any stretch of the imagination. Some were pretty opposed to this marriage. But in any case, and for whatever reasons, although it seems pretty clear that part of it was that at this moment in her life, Prudence needed some support, she married him on August 13th, 1834. Then on September 9th, 1834, as folks were starting to think about what's the next step, will Prudence Crandall get arrested again? Will there be another trial? Can she work something out with the town, with her allies, to have the school carry on? That didn't happen. September 9th was a night where she and some of her staff went to sleep. They put the girls who were boarding, which was almost all the students, they put them to bed on the second floor. And at a signal around midnight, a large group of men with some iron rods and with wooden clubs attacked the school and started smashing in the windows in the front of the school on the ground floor. They used the longer iron rods. to smash the windows on the second floor. There was just chaos and sheer panic inside the school. The silence of the night had been broken with the shouting, the smashing, the calls for help, and the people inside the school went into a defensive posture. They put all the young girls in the back of the school to be able to defend them. They were terrified. There'd been other incidents like this in other parts of the United States where people had been dragged out of their homes and beaten or killed. Riots like this based on race were happening in cities and other towns around the country at this very time. The people in Canterbury didn't dream up this tactic. This was something that was happening elsewhere. Things went silent. No one breached the door and came in. Some of the folks, there was a young man who had worked there who was also spending the night. Calvin Filio was there, her husband. They opened the door, they looked outside, and it seemed that the mob of men had gone away. No one got any sleep for the rest of that night. In the morning, Samuel May came to visit. He'd heard about the attack, and it was decided, and Prudence had to make the call, even though she was despondent about it, that they would need to close the school because they could not guarantee the safety of these young Black women. They had escaped the violence of that evening unbelievably without injury, even though there were some girls who were sleeping upstairs where glass came flying through the air, landed in their bed, landed on the floor, and yet there were no reported injuries. They could not guarantee that in the future. So, in the aftermath of this violent end of Prudence Crandall's school, what can we take away from this? What Prudence Crandall had endured, what the Harris family had helped bring about. Well, one thing was it helped to create the 14th Amendment. Those arguments of William Ellsworth that were published by William Lloyd Garrison in The Liberator, it was read widely, including by people who wound up running for and being elected to Congress later on and serving during the Civil War. And when it came time to pass the 14th Amendment, which provided equal protection under the law for all, guaranteeing that all would have the same privileges and immunities and protections, that those arguments that were spoken word by word by William Ellsworth were put into the 14th Amendment. You know, you don't have to read this word for word, but this is William Ellsworth's argument, talking about the privileges and immunities, talking about Article 4 of the Constitution that cited that, and saying that there needed to be equality and that we must conform that to the rule of action and the rule of law as much as possible. And the 14th Amendment recited that, took exactly that game plan, put in the language from Article 4 of the Constitution, guaranteeing privileges and immunities of all citizens to anyone born in the United States, regardless of race, and ensuring due process of law. 120 years later, the Crandall case would be one of the cases, and it wasn't the only case, cited in a brief prepared by Thurgood Marshall to the Supreme Court. It wasn't cited in the Brown case, and I certainly wouldn't say that the Crandall case tipped the scales or anything in Brown, but what was important was that Brown was decided on the basis of the 14th Amendment. And one of the key arguments to the court was that the abolitionist movement underscored the idea that the 14th Amendment was made to protect rights just like the right to education, the equal right to education. And that meant white students, Black students, students of all colors together. So Prudence and Sarah, they lived to see the end of the Civil War, the passage of the 14th Amendment, the end of slavery. Unfortunately, their dream of an integrated classroom, which was how this started out, it wound up right as a school for young Black women because, quite frankly, Prudence and her allies thought that would be less controversial, certainly less controversial than an integrated classroom, Black and white students together. Well, that didn't happen, and it wasn't ratified as a right in the United States until 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. And we are still, of course, today, trying to perfect that more perfect union with many challenges, as we all know, and don't have time to go into today when it comes to equality and equal rights in America. Sarah Harris, in her later years, she, of course, was married with Sarah Fairweather. Her husband, who was a blacksmith, lived in New London, then Kingston, Rhode Island. But she, who was always interested in education, was also very much involved in anti-slavery. She continued to correspond for the rest of his life with William Lloyd Garrison. She managed to meet and correspond with Frederick Douglass. She hosted both of them and many other anti-slavery activists in Rhode Island. And a dormitory is named after her at the University of Rhode Island. She continued to subscribe to The Liberator, sent checks to William Lloyd Garrison until that publication ended in 1865. In 1877, Prudence Crandall, who had moved from Connecticut out to Illinois, where her father had purchased some property, in 1877, she moved on from Illinois to Elk Falls, Kansas. Some would say she was almost tricked into a bad swap of property, and yet the stories that had been told to her about Kansas, that it was a land of more opportunity, that it was a progressive state, and some of this was true, but also that it was a terrific farm that she was purchasing. That wasn't true. She made a go of it and worked extremely hard, and her brother joined her out there and helped her with that. But it was a difficult time. And in the last years of her life, she worked very hard to literally live off the land. But that's not all she did. She remained an activist. She was a touchstone for women who learned about her. There was an article published in a magazine during this time period, a national magazine, talking about her school in the 1830s. And she was looked upon as a hero, and especially at a time when women's suffrage was beginning and the fight for the right to vote in Kansas and elsewhere was going on. So she was invited to speak out at meetings, and that's exactly what she did. Interestingly, she stayed in touch with Sarah Harris. Sarah Harris wrote her many letters. Over the years, Prudence Crandall said, you know, I would love to see you again. And it got to the point where, you know, where Sarah could possibly get away, Prudence could not get away from running her farm. And kind of unbelievably, in 1878, Sarah Harris Fairweather, made the decision to get on a train in Rhode Island and start the long transcontinental trek to Independence, Kansas, which was the last train stop before you could get to Elk Falls, and take the wagon ride, pretty long wagon ride into Elk Falls, where she was met by Prudence Crandall, who was living on a farm at that time. They had a joyful reunion, were together for about 2 weeks. One can only imagine what the conversations must have gone like and what they must have been thinking. Again, 1878, and yet reflecting back to 1832, when Sarah asked to be a student, 1833, when the new school was created, all of the challenges that they had lived through, and then all of the changes in the United States that they had seen. Later that very same year, Sarah became ill. She'd had an on and off problem with a swollen neck. And in November of 1878, she passed away. She's buried in the Fernwood Cemetery in Kingston, Rhode Island. Now, at this time also, with the dawn of technology, there were some additional challenges. The world experienced its first kind of worldwide pandemic fueled by trains, steamships, et cetera. It's called the Russian flu. And there was a significant outbreak with a couple 100,000 deaths in the United States, as well as Europe and elsewhere. The Russian flu came to Elk Falls because at that point the rail line had been completed and there was a train station in Elk Falls. Prudence Crandall was a high-risk patient, as we would say, knowing what we all experienced in the last couple of years. She got the Russian flu, passed away, and was buried in Elk Falls. She was 86 years old. Also want to point out that little paragraph down on the bottom. Her family, it's a good example of the times before modern medicine and the tragic impact it could have on a family in a 12-month period between 1837 and 1838. Again, remember her school closed in 1834. So just 3 years later, in a 12-month period, her sister Elmira, it wasn't Sarah. Earlier, I said Sarah. Elmira was her sister that helped her at the school. She died of tuberculosis. Her brother Reuben, who'd been arrested in Washington, D.C. on trumped-up charges. He was arrested basically because he was Prudence Crandall's brother. He had some anti-slavery literature and was charged essentially with treason. In jail, he contracted tuberculosis. He died. Her father, Pardon, had gone out to Illinois, the new property that they'd been able to purchase. He was helping to clear some land. When you cleared the land, some mosquitoes got busy. He got malaria. He died. And her sister-in-law died of infection after giving birth in July 1838. Such were the times before antibiotics and modern medicine. So just a few more things here, and then we can go to questions. My wife and I went out to Elk Falls, Kansas in 2013. I was just wrapping up the book, Prudence Crandall's Legacy. I wanted to see where Prudence Crandall was buried. Where we're standing right there, the little bit of brush and what looks like a depression back there, that was the old cellar hole for the house, for her farmhouse that you see a drawing of on the side there. Marjorie Cunningham was a historian. She's unfortunately passed away since then, but she was a historian for Elk Falls, was kind enough to help us find where that cellar hole was. More shots of Elk Falls. And those are the falls, by the way. And you can see there was once a grist mill there. This is a statue at the state capitol showing Prudence Crandall. I would like to think that the student is Sarah Harris. The sculptor didn't really intend that to be any particular student, but it makes sense to consider that Sarah Harris, I believe. So thank you very much for joining us here today, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions. Yes, Elena.
Alana, you have to unmute.
There we go. My intention 14 or so years ago when I established Harris Sisters Month with Otis Library was to create more attention and interest to and in the Black students at the school. But I have grown increasingly curious about whether or not the experience of the school had any positive transformative effects on the white students who Prudence withdrew from the school. Has there been any research on the white students, whether any of them went on to a career in abolition, or at least a transformation in sentiment?
don't know. That is a fabulous question. I mean, there's been a tremendous amount of scholarship and a lot of work trying to uncover the pathways of Prudence Crandall's former Black students who were at the school. And unfortunately, in some cases, it's hard to pick up the trail there. But there has been a surprising amount of information gained in that pursuit. But I can tell you that in the 1880s, there was a campaign to try to undo the wrong against Prudence Crandall, and it started in the town of Canterbury. And it started amongst townspeople who put together a petition and wanted the state of Connecticut to grant her a yearly pension. This was in 1886. And they went to Hartford, a bill was sponsored, and the people of Canterbury came up, and many others too, to testify in favor, but they led the charge. It's not out of the realm of possibilities. As a matter of fact, I'm sure some of the families whose daughters were involved. Now, whether they were former students or not, I don't know. But the town did try to make some amends there. And short story, the legislature killed the bill. It made the national news, and the legislature was shamed into giving Prudence Crandall a pension. It was supposed to be $500, but because the legislature was spiteful, they made it $400 a year. But that's a great question. I don't know specifically about that, other than that story that I just related.
Thank you.
Yeah. Karen.
Karen, did you have a question? Oh, Karen, you're muted. There you go.
Hi, Don. Thank you so much for this talk. I really appreciate it. Do you know what brought the Harris family to Canterbury, or where they lived in Canterbury?
They bought a farm. I'm not exactly sure where it was, and I don't believe that it exists. I have wondered about that. I've even wondered. There's part of me that just wonders if the fact that they came to Canterbury in 1832, at the time the school was in existence. I mean, I don't think that they were thinking so far ahead that they were moving because they wanted for Sarah to potentially be a student. But maybe they thought that there would be some more opportunity in Canterbury generally. But it does seem a little odd, right, that you're in Norwich. They own property there. They were part of a thriving community of color. They had friends and neighbors who shared their interests and shared in their anti-slavery publications and reading of the information. And then to go to Canterbury, I don't know, but I think that there's a sliver of a possibility that maybe somehow they'd heard about this school and they thought maybe, they didn't foresee the controversy, but maybe this would be a place where their children could get an education, their daughters could.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great questions, everyone. Any more questions? I'd like to thank Don for this wonderful program. This was so enlightening, so wonderful. Alana Sherman, who's our community volunteer for Harris this month at Otis Library, and Joni DiMartino, who is the curator at the Prudence Crandall Museum, is also on this meeting with us. So this is a great group of people here. Alana, did you have another question?
I had a comment. Well, first let me say what a fantastic presentation you make.
Yeah.
You set the context so beautifully. It was wonderful. I just wanted to say it's ironic that upon marrying the cantankerous Calvin, Prudence lost many of the rights that she previously had that enabled her to start the school.
That's true. We can all speculate, and I think her friends were speculating at the time too. Many, if not most of her friends had some big problems with Calvin, and one of her closest allies, Samuel May, who was the Unitarian minister, it got to the point where the minister who was supposed to marry Calvin and Prudence at the Congregational Church in Canterbury backed out at the last minute because he got pressure. And actually paid off. He got paid off by some of the parishioners not to marry Prudence because they just wanted to monkey wrench the ceremony. They were out to get Prudence. So they went off to Brooklyn. They got in a carriage, went off to basically present themselves to another minister, explain that they'd had the marriage posted in the church in Canterbury, but they didn't go to Samuel May in Brooklyn, who could have married them as a Unitarian minister. And he was so close to her, but he also was not a fan of Calvin. And I can only imagine that Prudence decided she didn't really want to ask Samuel May, who probably was not going to be able to wish them well as he was performing the ceremony. So they were married by a minister that they didn't know of the Congregational Church in Brooklyn. Now, she wasn't together with Calvin all that long. He was abusive to her and physically abusive to her. He also had mental health issues that became pretty serious later on. They lived apart for the better part of their marriage until the very end, when he was in very poor health and she was living in Illinois. And she took him in, not so much as a wife in a healthy marriage, but someone who really, as an act of compassion, took him in because he was not in good health or state of mind.
That's sad to think that that's what the rest of her life was like. Mhm.
Absolutely. Diane.
Hi, thank you. It was a great presentation. I was just curious if you found that the Liberator covered the stories of the school, and in particularly the contribution to legal changes or the legal trials or anything like that. What your thoughts were about how well the Liberator actually gave credit to the school for what it was doing.
Excellent question. There wasn't as much in the Liberator as I might have expected. There were some follow-up stories, and they did reprint some of the reporting that had been done. The Hartford Courant, which was in existence at the time, covered it pretty well. Matter of fact, that story I told about the pension in 1886, the Courant went to the wall on her behalf to shame the legislators and to get that done. But there was also another paper, The Unionist. I mentioned Charles Burleigh, who was from Plainfield. He and his brother William helped out at the schools, and they were incredibly bright and went on to other careers. But he published a newspaper called The Unionist. They bought a press. Arthur Tappan, believe it or not, came from New York City to visit the school one time. And Samuel May happened to be there and buttonholed him and said, look, we're getting killed here. The press is all against us. We need our own newspaper. And there's a press in Brooklyn that has recently shut down. If only we could buy that press and start it up and have our own newspaper, we would have a voice, sort of like what you're saying, to present our side of things. So he and Arthur Tappan got onto a carriage or a horse, went to Brooklyn, saw the place, and Arthur Tappan said, I'll buy it. I'll buy it, and you've got a newspaper. And Samuel May drafted, at that point, Charles Burleigh to be the editor, and he was, and put out The Unionist. He put out The Unionist weekly for at least a year, and there's only 4 copies of The Unionist known to exist. It was always my dream that somehow there would be a trunk that would, while I was writing this book, that would come into existence with the rest of the copies of The Unionist, that somebody would have put these things aside, because what a fascinating record that would have been. But some of what they wrote about her trials is there, and the current, again, has been a good source as well. And then William Lloyd Garrison, to his credit, did cover very well the trial and published word for word William Ellsworth's incredibly strong and predictive in terms of the future of our country arguments on her behalf.
That's so fascinating. Great questions, everyone. What a good group.
These are excellent.
Yeah. Any more?
I see someone that I know. It's my daughter from Colorado.
Oh, thank you for joining us.
Nina.
My pleasure. Hi. She's been.
That's her cat, Charlie.
Not so much a question, just a comment on, I feel like Prudence's whole lifespan and the choices that she made, the beliefs that she stood up for, is just a really shining example of how important it is to stick to those beliefs, even when they might feel in the face of everything else. And just, I just imagine her at that time feeling defeated at moments, and just feeling like she tried her best and things ultimately, from her, sort of smaller perspective, didn't work out, but they ended up making such a huge difference in history and like furthering that larger tide of anti-slavery. So I just think it's really cool to hear, like, see how this piece of the puzzle fits into the bigger picture. And of course, I've heard this story before a lot, but just wanted to to the group.
Nina is a rock climber, and like a superb rock climber, sort of internationally known. But when she was just starting out in rock climbing, and I would go with her to the rock gym in Rhode Island where she was going at the time, I would take my little black Apple laptop. This is back in like 2010, 11, et cetera. And I was working on the Prudence Crandall book at that point. And Nina, some of the times I was actually, typing into the laptop instead of watching all of your climbing.
How could you not witness every minute of my climbing progress?
Oh, that's a great story. Let's see, we've got several people thanking you for the great program, and the people looking forward to your future projects. Joni says, very informative as always. Very true, very true. So each time you come and speak with us, we feel like we just learned something new, something different. So this is great. It's just so much research going on, continuing on with you and other people who are different historical societies in the area that are continuing research on the families and the school, and seem to be unearthing new information all of the time. It's incredible. It really is.
Well, thank you. I did try to add a few more things into this, and there are always details that I don't have time for, but a shout out to Joni from the Prudence Crandall Museum, who's been on the call, and she's working on all kinds of things, including a symposium in the not too distant future on Prudence Crandall. So I'm looking forward to that, and Karen Cook and her good work at Norwich Free Academy. So
yes.
Thank you to everyone.
Yeah. Well, any last minute comments or questions, anyone, before we sign off for the evening? Again, thank you, Dawn, for a very informative talk. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and make sure to visit the Otis Library website to see the rest of the programs that we have going on for the month, and all the great stuff we have going on around history projects in this area. So thank you all. Thank you all for coming this evening. Good night.
Julie. Thanks very much. Thank you, Nina.